Honeybees need carbohydrates to survive. We know that they get that source of carbohydrates from nectar that they convert to honey that they can store in their hive, and then they have that sugar available for months or sometimes even years, depending on where they place it and how quickly they use it. There are times where honeybees experience carbohydrate deficiencies, right? There are times where there's not nectiferous flowers available in the environment, where bees can't go out, forage on nectar, bring it back to their nest, and convert it to honey. Honeybees store honey for those periods of nectar dearth. But even still, there are times where their honey reserves are completely depleted and there's nothing available in the environment for them to collect. And that's the point that we as beekeepers need to step in and consider feeding our bees. There's a big debate now on whether or not beekeepers should feed bees, whether it's natural to feed bees or not. I would say that when we put bees in boxes, we have an ethical obligation to take care of them. If they are running out of carbohydrate, we need to provide that carbohydrate to them. So I have no ethical dilemma feeding bees that carbohydrate source. So what is it that we feed bees when they run out of nectar or they run out of stored honey? We feed them sugar. There's really two types of sugar that beekeepers feed to their bees. The first of those is sucrose, which is really just a combination of fructose and glucose. And the second type of sugar that beekeepers will feed bees is fructose directly, usually in the form of high fructose corn syrup. There's a little debate even about that, whether sucrose is better or fructose is better. I would simply argue that when bees don't have energy and the source of carbohydrate, we need to supply that energy, and getting sugar into that colony is what's most important. Whether or not you have access to fructose or sucrose is really not important in this context. What's important is that if you recognize that your colony has a need for carbohydrate, you need to supply that. So what do we feed in the way of carbohydrate? Well, like everything in beekeeping, there's a great debate there as well. If you read the books, if you listen to a lot of beekeepers, there's this old adage that you tend to feed 1-to-1 sugar in spring and early summer, and you feed 2-to-1 sugar in late summer and fall. And the reasoning goes like this. 1-to-1 sugar has a higher moisture content, so it's much more like nectar, right? Nectar's got a high moisture content, a lower sugar content. So when you're feeding bees 1-to-1, you're stimulating them, you're making those bees think that there's incoming nectar, so they're going to grow their colonies. Whereas when you transition to that 2-to-1 sugar syrup, that 2 parts sugar to 1 part water, it's what bees would be storing away for winter reserves in late summer or early fall. Frankly, I think we think a little bit too much about this. I believe it causes a lot of new beekeepers, especially, angst, trying to figure out whether they should feed 1-to-1 or 2-to-1. I like to err on the side of a little bit higher concentration of sugar rather than lower concentration of sugar. The whole point of feeding bees is to get sugar into their hives, and I like to do that with as much sugar as possible. And there's also debate on whether that 1 part sugar to 1 part water is by volume or by weight. Same with the 2-to-1. The truth is, it's better and more accurate if you do it by weight. So 1 weight of water to the same weight of sugar would make 1-to-1. 2 parts sugar to 1 part water would make 2-to-1, but very few beekeepers I know are going to weigh out their sugar, weigh out their water, and I think that's perfectly okay. I just do the eyeball test. Here, I have a couple of jars, one that is roughly half filled with table sugar, which is sucrose, one that is roughly 2/3 filled with table sugar or sucrose. So I would consider this close to 1-to-1 and this close to 2-to-1. How I would handle this at this point is I would use hot water from the sink to put into these jars. Really the most important consideration when you're trying to make 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 in this low volume is the amount of water it's going to take and the temperature of that water to be able to dissolve that sugar in the first place. If you use hot water from the tap, that's probably sufficient to dissolve a 1-to-1 jar of sugar syrup, but if you use hot water from the tap, you're probably not adding enough hot water or getting it hot enough to make all of this sugar dissolve. So usually if you are moving up in sugar concentration, you're going to have to move up in the water temperature that you use to dissolve that sugar. This particular jar here has already been dissolved. It's a 2-to-1 mixture of sugar to water, and this is something that we'd be putting on our bees honestly year-round. But if you're concerned about that, you can always follow the old adage, 1-to-1 in spring and early summer, 2-to-1 in late summer, early fall. I will tell you, 1-to-1 ferments faster or spoils faster than does 2-to-1. So that pushes a lot of beekeepers in the direction of using these higher concentrations of sugar. Obviously, the more colonies that you need to feed, the greater the volume of sugar you're going to need to mix. Commercial beekeepers aren't individually mixing jars of sugar syrup. They're mixing it in great batches. When I was keeping bees as a kid, I would use 5-gallon buckets. I would half fill the bucket with sugar, fill the rest with water, and just stir it with a stick. Commercial beekeepers are doing it in even larger batches, and in fact, a lot of beekeeping equipment supply companies will sell pre-mixed sugar to commercial beekeepers. They show up with large totes at these supply companies, and it will literally be pumped into these totes a lot like gasoline into a truck. They'll have these large volumes of pre-mixed sugar syrup, either high fructose sugar or sucrose-based sugar syrup, and then they'll be able to take that directly out into the field. Most hobbyist beekeepers and sideline beekeepers, though, are going to be mixing it in smaller batches, so you'll just have to get used to the water temperature it's going to take and the volume that you're able to use to dissolve that sugar. Again, I prefer to err on the higher side with the sugar. I think it gets bees the energy they need quicker, as well as stabilizes that sugar and makes it less prone to fermentation so quickly. So how does one decide when actually to feed bees a source of carbohydrate? Well, I use a few things to help me know when it's time to provide some carbohydrates to bees. First of all, I think about what are my management goals? What is it that I'm trying to get this colony to do? I might feed bees outside of normal feeding seasons just to cause those colonies to grow, to get them to have this available carbohydrate source coming in so they can rear brood, expand their nest, perhaps pull some comb for me. So it might be something that occurs outside of typical season. However, most of the time that I would want to feed this colony, I'm wanting to do it in response to a lack of carbohydrates. Maybe they don't have enough stored resources, maybe there's not enough resources coming in from the environment. So how do I make those decisions? Well, first things first, this colony needs a critical mass of stored carbohydrates to survive. They store that in the way of honey. So there's really two ways that I can assess the amount of stored honey in this nest. The first of those is one I've advocated for a very long time. I call it the hoist test. You know that the boxes of the hives have these nifty handles in them. So I will put my hand in the handle at the back of the nest and simply rock it forward a little bit. If it's really easy to pick up off the stand, like this one is, then I know that they don't have enough stored resources. I know that phrase, really easy, is very subjective. What's really easy for me may be different from what's really easy for you. What you're going to have to do is calibrate yourself based on other healthy colonies in the apiary. Let me give you an example of how to do this. If this box were full of honey, they would have enough honey to survive. I would not need to feed them. So I would try to find a hive whose uppermost box is mostly full of honey and try to rock it forward to see what that weight is. And I would compare that weight to the other hives I'm rocking forward when deciding on whether or not to feed a particular colony in that nest. The second way you can determine whether or not a particular colony needs feed is simply the eyeball test. You can go into this nest and look for honey stores. Are you seeing stored honey? If I go into this hive and remove this super, is it heavy? If I take off the lid of this hive and look at the frames, do I see ample amounts of stored honey? If I'm only running a single hive and there's not even a second box on top, am I seeing stored honey in those combs? Am I seeing bees come in from the field that are laden with nectar? That's a little bit tricky. You can see bees that are coming in with pollen. They have the pollen on the hind legs. But you can know it's a nectar flow when you see lots of bees coming in without pollen, and when you go into the nest, remove a frame, turn it sideways, and lightly shake it. If liquid is raining out of the comb, then you're in an active nectar flow. So knowing that nectar is coming in, or seeing stored honey, or doing the hoist test are all ways that I use to determine if this colony needs feed. So let's assume, for purposes of this video, that this colony needs to be fed. let me show you now some of the ways that I can get carbohydrates directly to the colony in this hive. Before I do that, let me get my veil on and let me bring a smoker so that we can work these bees safely. So I'm going to start by showing you how to use a jar feeder to administer sugar syrup to a hive. This particular case, this jar I can fill up with sugar syrup. It's got 2 holes in the lid so that when you invert the jar, capillary action will keep that sugar syrup suspended in the jar and the bees can drink from the holes in the bottom. Now, there are a few places on this hive that you can administer a jar like this, but the first place I'm going to show you how to do that is by using an entrance feeder. This is a specially designed piece to accommodate the jar. It slides into the entrance of the hive, and bees can walk into the entrance of the feeder and access the holes in the jar through this rim. So first things first, I need to administer this feeder to the entrance of a hive. I'll use my hive tool to do that. You may have to pry the box a little bit from the bottom board to be able to slide that in. If you notice, I like to put my feeder off to one side of the nest, and I do that for very strategic purposes. I don't want to interfere with bee flight. So having it to one side or the other keeps it out of the way of bee flight into and out of the entrance of the nest. And now that I have this in place, it's just real simple to take this jar and invert it over the hole, and voila, you've administered sugar syrup to this colony. Now, I want to point out a couple things you really need to know. Number one, when I invert this jar, before that suction takes place, there will be a little bit of drippage. If you invert the jar over the hive stand, over the entrance, you're dropping sugar syrup on this hive and making it attractive to other bees that might start robbing this hive. So I either do that over the ground and let the dripping cease, or I do it over the entrance of the entrance feeder so that if there is any drippage, it goes into the feeder. So I'd invert it like so, and now it's safely on the hive. Another way to administer this jar feeder is through the lid of migratory covers. This particular lid is a migratory cover. Migratory covers have holes in the middle. I'm going to pop this lid to show you that. They have holes in the middle made to accommodate feeder jars like the one I've shown you. When a jar is not administered to the hive, you have a lid in place to close that hole so that rain can't get into it. So really all you need to do in this place is use your hive tool to pop out that lid. And once you have the lid removed, you can take the jar and again invert it slowly over the hole so that the sugar syrup goes into the nest. And now you've administered the feed in this jar to this particular colony in this hive. So using a jar feeder through the lid or using a jar feeder through an entrance feeder are really good ways to get sugar syrup to the nest. The advantage of using a jar feeder is that you can see the actual level of sugar syrup remaining in the jar, either here at the top or at the front. But one of the downsides is, especially if you're feeding one-to-one sugar syrup and the bees are taking it slow, it might be prone to spoilage or fermentation to where you see some black scuzz developing on the inside of the jar. A lot of beekeepers feed through the lid. We do this a lot here at the University of Florida Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory. Fewer beekeepers use entrance feeders because, as you might imagine, robbing bees only need to go right here to get to this sugar syrup. Whereas if the sugar syrup is administered here, robbing bees have to fight their way through the entire nest to get to that sugar syrup. There are 3 additional things I want to point out about jar feeders. Number one, when people fill them, they tend to get the outside very sticky, and this causes robbing. So you really want your jar feeder not to be sticky. Number 2, syrup will often collect right around the rim where the lid and the jar meet. So when you put this feeder on a hive, you will often see bees from other colonies robbing sugar syrup right around the rim of that jar. That's not usually a big problem unless bees are going into the nest as a result of you having this sticky jar here. The third thing to point out is these holes often get fitted with propolis by the bees once the jar is empty. So think about it this way. As long as bees are able to access sugar syrup through these holes, they'll keep those holes open and free flowing. But the moment the jar is empty, they'll actually plug those holes with propolis. So I like to take a small nail with me into the apiary to clean out that propolis before inverting the jar over the lid hole or the entrance feeder. This ensures a free flow of sugar syrup that the bees can access as they're feeding from those two different locations. Now I'm going to show you how to administer sugar syrup through the top of the nest. Of course, I just showed you how to do that through a jar, but there's 3 additional ways that I can show you how to do that. 2 of those ways concern hive top feeders. They're simply feeders that, as the name implies, go on top of the hive. You'll notice I've removed the lid of this nest. You can see frames, you can see bees, and right here is a great place to add sugar syrup to this nest. And so the first hive top feeder style I'll show you goes like this. The bees can walk up through this crack in the feeder. These 2 chambers will hold the sugar syrup that I provide to the bees, and there's 2 raths in these chambers that will float based on the sugar syrup level. So the administration of these types of feeders is really simple. You put it right on top of the nest after you've removed the lid. Then you can fill up both chambers with sugar syrup. Bees will come up through the center opening and do the rest. One really big pro of using this type of feeder is that you can administer a lot of sugar water to this colony at one time. The downside with that is if you're feeding sugar syrup in larger volumes than the bees can take quickly, especially if you're feeding sugar syrup that is 1-to-1 sugar syrup or lower, it might be prone to fermentation or spoilage. Another thing to keep in mind with this type of feeder is that it works best if your hive is level, because you can administer more sugar syrup. If your hive is tilted, you'll be able to put less sugar syrup in both of these chambers. This particular hive top feeder has an opening such that when you remove the lid of the nest, you can physically see bees. So while this is a really good hive top feeder, there's a second style of hive top feeder that makes it where bees can't come get you when you take the lid off of that hive. So I'll show you how that feeder works. In that feeder, essentially what you have is a wooden super that you drop a plastic tray into, and this contraption here makes it where bees can come up through the hole, walk down this terraced side, and access the sugar syrup. But by placing this on top of that hole, now bees can't get to you. So when you administer this feeder to the nest, bees can come up, feed and access sugar syrup without you getting bees coming after you when you take off the lid and refill this feeder. It has the same pros and cons otherwise as the other hive top feeder, in that you can provide large volumes of sugar syrup. That's great. In this place, you can do that without the risk of bees coming after you. But the downside is if you feed a lighter sugar syrup, a 1-to-1 or lower, or if you put more in here than they can take, that sugar syrup may be prone to spoilage or fermentation. There's another way that you can feed sugar syrup from the top of the hives as well. There are many feeders available that literally sit on top of the nest that administer sugar syrup to bees. In this particular feeder's case, you unscrew the feeder base, you fill it with sugar syrup, and the feeder base has holes in the middle that the bees can collect sugar syrup from, and just like with the jar feeder, you need to ensure each time that those holes don't contain propolis. And then this feeder has legs that raises the feeder off of the surface to give bees a little bit of space to access. Now there are styles of this type of feeder that go directly on the frames. The instructions for this feeder say that you should use an inner cover when you're using this feeder. And how that works is the inner cover will have that hole in the middle. Now you can put that feeder over the top of it with the hole right over the hole in the inner cover. And then you can surround that feeder with a super, and then can return your lid to the hive and make it where this feeder is completely encapsulated by that lid. So all of these hive top feeders are really good if your colonies are strong enough to go into those feeders and take those large volumes of sugar syrup. Again, some of the negatives associated with it is you can't leave that sugar syrup in there too long because it risks spoilage. The final way that I'm going to show you how to administer sugar syrup to the hive requires me to go all the way down into the brood nest. So what I'll do in this case is I've got to remove the super, I've got to remove the queen excluder that's on this hive, so I'll lightly smoke the bees to let them know that I'm coming. Since this excluder is on the super, I like to tip it up to make sure the queen is not present on the excluder, and she's not. And now I'm in the brood nest and I can administer that final type of feeder. The final feeder type is a division board feeder. A lot of people call these frame feeders. And as the name implies, they take the place of one of the frames in the lowermost box. So this can hold about a gallon or 3.7 liters of sugar syrup. You can get a larger size that will hold even more. The newer feeder styles have these little screened tubes that bees can walk down into, access the sugar water, and walk back out of. Before these types of tubes were added, you had to put a floating device in these feeders so the bees wouldn't drown. Now these are wider than the average frame. So hopefully I'll only need to remove one frame from this nest, but occasionally using this type of feeder you might have to remove two. So I'm going to smoke the bees. I don't want to remove a frame of brood or a frame of honey because that's what I'm trying to do, is give them carbohydrate source. So I'll look down on the nest and see the candidate frame that might be the best frame to remove. I see one here on this side of the nest that looks primarily like a frame of foundation. So I remove it from the nest, and sure enough, it is a frame of foundation. And then I would simply drop this feeder in its place in that nest. So I can see there's not a lot of space there, so I'll use my hive tool to push all the frames over from one side of the nest. Or you can work frames individually, one at a time, towards the wall, away from where you're going to be placing the feeder. So now I've worked all the frames towards me in the nest, away from the space where I'm going to be placing this division board feeder, and it simply pushes into the nest like so. Now at this point, it needs more space, so you can rock the frames away, or you might have to make that decision to take out that 9th frame so that you can get it fully into the nest and completely recessed in the nest. In this particular case, there's not enough space, so I would take out that 9th frame to give myself a little bit of space for this feeder. So now with this division board feeder in place, having had to take out 2 frames, I would work all of these frames back towards the feeder and make sure they are equally spaced within the nest. One of the obvious advantages of this type of feeder is it can hold large volumes of sugar syrup. One of the clear disadvantages is I have to go into the nest every time I want to feed the bees, and that's not always convenient. So in all of these systems where I've shown you how to provide sugar syrup to bees, when do you stop feeding? Well, I'll talk to a lot of new beekeepers whose mentors told them, it's a new hive, you've got to feed that colony, feed that colony. I never just feed bees. I always make my decision based on those criteria I mentioned before. What am I trying to get out of these bees? What season is it? Is there incoming nectar? Do the bees have stores of honey? If they do, you don't have to feed them. Some beekeepers may never have to feed. So I will stop administering sugar syrup to a colony like this when I determine it has enough resources. In my standard hive configuration that has a deep queen excluder and a medium super, I like to see that medium super full of honey. Once it's full of honey, which may take a few feedings or many feedings, then I stop feeding. I don't simply just feed. So I've reassembled this hive to go over a final series of ways that you can feed sugar to bees. Everything I've discussed up until this point is administering liquid sugar of some sort to bees. Now, a lot of beekeepers, especially in colder climates, especially in fall and winter, don't feed liquid sugar to bees. Instead, they feed solid sugar. And there's really 3 ways that you can feed dry sugar to bees. The first of those ways is through a candy board, which essentially you're taking granulated sugar and moistening it with water just a little bit to form a hard cake that you place right on top of the bees, or you might actually place it on top of an inner cover like so, right over the opening. A second way is you can do something called fondant. Fondant is a very specific recipe of sugar and a few other ingredients that stabilize that sugar and make it pliable and available for bees through winter. And then the third way is that you can literally mound a pile of granulated sugar. Some people call this the mountaintop method, where you're just making a mountain of sugar that you then put that empty super around and then the lid on, so the bees have this area where they can access it. These are ways to get sugar to bees in what I consider somewhat dire circumstances. I feel it's always better to administer sugar via a liquid format. There is a final way that you could administer sugar syrup to bees, and that's by volume feeding in the outdoors. A lot of beekeepers will put out tubs with lots of floating pieces of sticks, things like that, and they'll administer the sugar syrup there. The idea is you don't have to go into each individual hive to feed those colonies. You can mass feed. All the bees in the apiary will go there. So it is a quick way to administer sugar syrup, really to lots of colonies at one time. However, there are obvious drawbacks, and that the stronger colonies tend to go collect that sugar syrup more so than the weaker ones that may need it. It's a great way to incite robbing. It's a great way to spread disease. So I would say you would only feed in the open under very limited circumstances. One last word of warning: you shouldn't feed sugar while your bees are making marketable honey. If there's clear evidence that nectar is coming in from the outside, you don't want to be making marketable honey, because bees might store what you are providing to them into those honey supers, which will adulterate your pure honey. The keys to administering carbohydrates to colonies is to feed only when necessary, feed only what they need, and to stop feeding once they have enough. If you do all of these things, then you'll ensure that your colonies are healthy and productive. Happy beekeeping.